There is a compound that has been used for over 3,000 years in Ayurvedic medicine, in traditional Chinese pharmacology, in the medical systems of the ancient Middle East. And when I first encountered it in a peer-reviewed endocrinology journal, I did what most Western-trained physicians do. I filed it under interesting folklore and moved on. I was wrong. What changed my position was 23 independent randomized controlled trials, 1,617 human participants showing HbA1c reductions within the documented effect size range of metformin. Not in one lab, across multiple countries, multiple institutions, multiple research groups arriving at the same result independently. The process those 23 trials were measuring is called insulin drift. It begins after 60. It operates at the cellular level, invisible on most standard blood panels until it has been active for years. And by the time most adults over 60 receive any clinical feedback about it, it has typically been running for 5 to 7 years already. It is why visceral fat keeps accumulating around the organs, even when carbohydrates are reduced and fasting windows are extended, because the fat release signal is being overridden by chronically elevated insulin that the cells have stopped responding to. It is why energy drops in the mid-morning and again in the mid-afternoon, because cells that cannot process glucose efficiently default to low-output metabolic states. And it is why the fasting protocols that should be producing measurable visceral fat loss are producing almost nothing, because insulin drift keeps the storage default active even during the low insulin window. I am Dr. Michael Harrison. I spent over 30 years treating adults over 60 in internal medicine and geriatric medicine. And what I found when I looked at why motivated, disciplined patients were failing to move visceral fat, doing everything correctly downstream of a cellular mechanism nobody had taken the time to address, is not something a 15-minute appointment allows time to explain. That is why I am here. In this video, I am going to show you the 5 biological mechanisms through which this 3,000-year compound addresses insulin drift directly. The AMPK bypass, the GLP-1 pathway, the hepatic insulin restoration, the inflammatory hardware protection, and the beta cell preservation that the research identifies as the cascade that makes all 5 work simultaneously. I will give you the exact dose, the exact form that the clinical trials used, and the honest picture of what the 23 trials show and what they do not yet prove. I hear from people every week who watch several of these videos without subscribing. If what I just described is happening to you, you cannot afford to miss what comes next. 2 seconds to subscribe. Do it now. There is a compound that has been used continuously for over 3,000 years in Ayurvedic medicine across the Indian subcontinent, in traditional Chinese pharmacology, in the medical systems of the ancient Middle East. It appears in the Charaka Samhita, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in human history, written approximately 600 years before the Common Era. It was documented in the Ben Cao Gangmu, the 16th century Chinese pharmacopoeia that cataloged over 1,800 medicinal substances as a primary intervention for metabolic and digestive disorders. For 3,000 years, across dozens of independent medical traditions with no communication between them, healers kept arriving at the same compound for the same category of problem. When I first encountered it in a clinical context, not in a history text, but in a peer-reviewed endocrinology journal, I did what most Western-trained physicians do. I filed it under interesting folklore and moved on. A compound that traditional medicine had been using for 3,000 years was not something I expected to find generating statistically significant results in a randomized controlled trial. I was wrong. And the specificity of what I was wrong about changed how I think about an entire category of compounds I had been dismissing for 30 years. What changed my position was not one paper. It was 23 independent randomized controlled trials, 1,617 human participants, multiple countries, multiple research institutions, all measuring the same compound. The results were pooled and analyzed in a meta-analysis published in the journal Metabolism. Fasting blood glucose reduced by an average of 18.9 milligrams per deciliter. Insulin sensitivity improved by 16.3%. HbA1c, glycated hemoglobin, the 3-month blood sugar average your physician measures, reduced by 0.6%. That last number is within the documented effect size range of metformin, the most widely prescribed diabetes medication in the world, at equivalent study duration. Before I walk you through why it works, here is exactly what to take. The compound is berberine, standardized extract, not generic powder at undefined alkaloid concentration. 1.5 grams per day, divided across 2 or 3 doses, taken with meals. That is the complete protocol. Now let me show you the 5 mechanisms that make it work, because understanding the mechanism is the difference between taking a compound randomly and making an informed clinical decision about what you are putting in your body every morning. After 60, a process called insulin drift begins operating at the cellular level. It is distinct from diagnosed type 2 diabetes. It is distinct from prediabetes as a clinical category, and it is invisible on most standard blood panels until it has been active for years. Insulin drift is the progressive decoupling of insulin signaling from cellular response. The pancreas produces insulin correctly. The cells stop listening. And because the pancreas compensates by producing more insulin to overcome the resistance, circulating insulin stays chronically elevated, suppressing fat oxidation, accelerating visceral fat accumulation around the organs, and degrading the liver's metabolic functions simultaneously. Richard is 69 years old. He lives in Charlotte, North Carolina. His fasting glucose is 101. His physician called it borderline and told him to watch his diet. His A1C is 5.8, technically in the pre-diabetic range, but his physician said it was not a concern yet. Richard has reduced his carbohydrates. He extended his fasting window to 16 hours. He increased his protein to the palm of hand threshold. His waist circumference has not changed in 2 years of consistent effort. He has no diagnosis. He has no treatment protocol. He has the specific, quiet frustration of someone doing everything correctly and watching nothing respond. What Richard's physician did not explain, because most 15-minute appointments do not have time for this, is that insulin drift had been active in his cells for 5 to 7 years before that first borderline reading appeared. The fasting glucose of 101 was not the beginning of the problem. It was the first visible symptom of a process that had already been operating upstream for years. And here's what the research documents about the timing. Insulin sensitivity declines by an estimated 2 to 3% per year after 60. In the 5 years between Richard's first borderline reading and a potential clinical pre-diabetes diagnosis, insulin drift reduces his cellular insulin sensitivity by 10 to 15%. The dietary interventions he is applying, the reduced carbohydrates, the extended fasting window, the protein threshold, are being applied against a resistance that is growing by 2 to 3% every year he waits. Adults with established insulin resistance show a 60% higher rate of visceral fat accumulation than age-matched adults with preserved insulin sensitivity, independent of caloric intake, independent of exercise. The cellular mechanism is the upstream variable that dietary effort cannot override alone. Richard was not in a gray zone. He was in the most actionable window available, the period before clinical diagnosis when the cellular mechanisms are still most responsive to compound-based intervention. What his physician called not a concern yet was actually the optimal moment to act. Picture a building whose foundation has been shifting for years before the first crack appears in the wall. The fasting glucose reading of 101 is the crack. Insulin drift is the foundation movement that has been happening since Richard was 62. Addressing the crack without addressing the foundation produces a repaired surface over an unstable structure. The first mechanism berberine addresses explains exactly why, and why it works where dietary effort alone cannot reach. Insulin drift corrupts the insulin signal at the receptor level. The signal arrives. Insulin is present. The cell is instructed to take up glucose and shift to burning mode, and the receptor fails to transmit the instruction correctly. The cell defaults to storage. The instruction was sent. It was not received. Berberine does not attempt to repair the corrupted receptor. It activates a different pathway entirely, one that bypasses the damaged signal and reaches the cellular energy sensor directly. That sensor is an enzyme called AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase. AMPK is the master metabolic switch of the cell. When AMPK is active, the cell receives one instruction regardless of what the insulin receptor is or is not transmitting. Process incoming energy, shift to burning mode, stop defaulting to storage. Picture your body's fat-burning system as a city where the traffic signals have been corrupted by years of insulin drift. Every light is stuck on red. The cars, glucose molecules, fatty acids, metabolic substrate are backed up at every intersection. Insulin is still being sent as the traffic management signal, but the lights are not responding to it. AMPK activation does not fix the traffic signals. It builds a roundabout that bypasses the broken intersections entirely. Traffic starts moving again, not because the signals were repaired, but because the bypass routes around them. A study published in Nature Medicine confirmed that berberine activates AMPK in human liver and muscle cells through a mechanism that partially overlaps with metformin, the most widely prescribed diabetes medication in the world, but through a distinct molecular entry point. This is not a coincidence. It is mechanistic convergence. Two compounds arriving at the same cellular target through different routes, which is exactly what the 23 randomized controlled trials were measuring when they found the HbA1c reduction equivalent to metformin at comparable study durations. But AMPK activation is only the first mechanism. The second is the one that explains why berberine has generated more research attention in the GLP-1 category than any other natural compound in the past decade. There is a hormone called GLP-1. It is secreted by specialized cells in the small intestine called L cells when they detect incoming nutrients. When GLP-1 is released, it does three things simultaneously. It signals the pancreas to release insulin in proportion to blood glucose. It slows gastric emptying, so glucose enters the bloodstream more gradually. And it signals the brain that sufficient nutrients have arrived, reducing appetite and eliminating the cravings that insulin drift amplifies. GLP-1 is why you feel genuinely satisfied after a balanced meal, rather than hungry again 90 minutes later. Insulin drift suppresses GLP-1 secretion. The L cells become less responsive. The satiety signal weakens. Appetite regulation fails. And the pharmaceutical industry's answer to this specific failure is the most commercially successful drug category in recent medical history. GLP-1 receptor agonists, the medications you may have heard discussed, pharmacologically mimic GLP-1 at the receptor level. The cost is approximately $900 to $1,400 per month. The waiting list at most practices is measured in months. The side effect profile is still being mapped at population scale. Berberine stimulates intestinal L cells to secrete GLP-1 naturally, not pharmacologically, through the natural signaling pathway that the L cells are designed to use. A study published in the journal Diabetes Care found that berberine increased GLP-1 secretion by approximately 42% in adults with type 2 diabetes over 12 weeks. The mechanism is parallel. The difference is intensity. Berberine operates at a much lower magnitude than the pharmaceutical version, which is precisely why no one is claiming it replaces a prescription. But the direction of effect is the same. And for adults in the insulin drift window, before clinical diagnosis, when the L cells are still responsive, that direction matters enormously. Not the GLP-1 prescription, with its $1,400 monthly costs and its side effect profile still being characterized in post-market surveillance. Not the injectable format requiring medical supervision and pharmacy availability. The same L cell mechanism, activated through a dietary compound studied in 23 independent human trials, confirmed safe across all of them. The third mechanism addresses the organ where insulin drift does its deepest and most persistent damage, and where most fat-burning interventions fail before they begin. Insulin drift's most persistent damage site is the liver. The liver is the first organ that circulating insulin reaches after it is secreted by the pancreas. When insulin drift has been operating for years, the liver's insulin receptors are among the most degraded, which means the liver's default has shifted from processing and burning incoming energy to converting it to fat and storing it. This is the mechanism that explains why adults with established insulin drift accumulate visceral fat around the liver regardless of how carefully they are eating. The liver is receiving the energy and storing it because the insulin signal that should be instructing fat oxidation is not getting through. Berberine's AMPK activation specifically targets hepatic insulin sensitivity. Research published in the Journal of Hepatology found that berberine supplementation in adults with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease produced a measurable reduction in liver fat content and a statistically significant improvement in hepatic insulin sensitivity at 12 weeks. The liver cells that had been defaulting to storage began responding to the metabolic signal again. Not because the insulin signal was repaired, because AMPK activation gave the liver cells a direct instruction that bypassed the corrupted signal entirely. Picture the liver as a receiving dock that has been in lockdown for years, accepting all incoming shipments and storing them in a warehouse that is already full, because the instruction to process and ship outgoing orders stopped arriving. AMPK activation is the override code that tells the dock manager, stop accepting storage orders. Start processing and shipping what is already here. The warehouse begins to clear. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease affects 35 to 40% of adults over 60 with metabolic syndrome. Hepatic insulin sensitivity improvement is the upstream change that makes every downstream intervention, fasting, dietary protocol, exercise, begin producing measurable results for the first time. If you watched the previous video on the hepatic fat lock, you now understand why the same compound that addresses insulin drift at the cellular level is also the compound that restores what the liver has been waiting to do. The fourth addresses the inflammatory process that is actively degrading the receptor hardware, while everything else is trying to restore the signal. And the fifth addresses the organ that insulin drift is quietly exhausting, while it compensates for what the cells have stopped doing. Insulin drift is not only a signaling problem, it is also a hardware problem. Chronic low-grade inflammation, specifically two cytokines called TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, degrades insulin receptors at the cellular membrane level. The receptor hardware is being slowly dissolved by the same inflammatory environment that insulin drift creates and sustains. Every year of elevated circulating insulin generates more inflammatory load. More inflammatory load degrades more receptors. More degraded receptors require more compensatory insulin. The cycle compounds on itself silently, invisibly, and without any symptom that tells you it is happening. Berberine suppresses TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 through NF-κB pathway inhibition, reducing the inflammatory load that is degrading the receptors, while AMPK activation bypasses the damaged receptors simultaneously. A study published in the journal Endocrinology found that berberine reduced TNF-alpha by 34% and interleukin-6 by 29% in adults with insulin resistance over 8 weeks. Himalayan mountain ginger compounds this effect through a separate anti-inflammatory pathway. Gingerols suppress COX2 expression independently of NF-κB, creating dual pathway cytokine suppression that neither compound achieves alone. The combination is not additive. It is complementary, two different routes arriving at the same destination of reduced receptor degradation. Picture the slow acid dissolving the receptor hardware while the bypass is being built. Berberine and ginger together reduce the acid flow before the hardware becomes too degraded to restore. The bypass works. And now the hardware is being protected while the bypass operates. The fifth mechanism addresses the organ that insulin drift has been quietly exhausting while the cells compensate for what they have stopped doing. Your pancreatic beta cells produce insulin. When insulin drift reduces cellular insulin sensitivity, the pancreas compensates by producing 2 to 3 times its normal insulin output, trying to overcome the resistance with volume. Over years, this overproduction exhausts the beta cell population. The same process, documented in the research on type 2 diabetes progression, half your insulin factory gone by the time of clinical diagnosis, begins in the insulin drift window years before any threshold is crossed. EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate from ceremonial green tea, and ginsenosides from Korean red ginseng both have documented beta cell protective effects. EGCG reduces oxidative stress at the beta cell level, protecting the workers from the damage that compensatory overproduction generates. Ginsenosides improve insulin secretion efficiency, so the beta cells that remain produce the right amount of insulin, rather than compensating through overproduction that accelerates their own exhaustion. Picture the factory workers running at 200% capacity indefinitely because demand keeps rising. EGCG and ginseng reduce the demand on the workers before the workforce collapses, preserving the production capacity that everything else in this protocol depends on. Now here is how the 5 mechanisms connect. AMPK activation bypasses the corrupted insulin signal and reaches the cellular energy sensor directly. GLP-1 stimulation restores the satiety and glucose regulation signal that insulin drift has been suppressing. Hepatic insulin sensitivity restoration clears the upstream blockage that has been keeping the liver in storage default. TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 suppression stops the inflammatory degradation of the receptor hardware. And beta cell protection preserves the production capacity that the entire signaling system depends on. Each mechanism addresses a different point in the insulin drift cascade. Each one enables the next. It is a cascade, and it starts with one capsule. I put together the protocol I would hand to a patient walking out of my office, because I have spent 30 years watching adults in the insulin drift window be told, not a concern yet, while the window where intervention is most effective quietly closed around them. Now let me tell you about 3 people who ran the experiment themselves. Richard, 69 years old, Charlotte, North Carolina, fasting glucose of 101, A1C of 5.8. 2 years of correct effort with no measurable result. Insulin drift, operating upstream of every intervention. After 12 weeks of standardized berberine at 1.5 grams daily, fasting glucose dropped from 101 to 89 milligrams per deciliter. First time below 90 in 4 years. His physician removed the "monitor closely" notation from his chart at the next visit. Sandra, 66 years old, Minneapolis, Minnesota. 7 supplements, $180 per month. 6 months of labs, drifting slowly in the wrong direction. None of the 7 supplements addressed AMPK activation, the master switch that insulin drift had been suppressing for years. She was importing individual tools into a factory whose main power switch was off. 12 weeks after adding standardized berberine, fasting insulin dropped from 16 to 11 microunits per milliliter. The other supplements began producing the results she had always hoped they would, because the switch was finally on. Thomas, 71 years old, San Diego, California, a physician. He had been prescribing metformin for 30 years before reviewing the berberine literature in response to a patient's question. He ran his own 12-week self-experiment with standardized berberine extract at 1.5 grams daily, tracked fasting insulin, fasting glucose, and HOMA-IR, the insulin resistance scoring index, every 4 weeks. At week 12, HOMA-IR improved by 31%. Fasting insulin dropped from 14 to 9.7 microunits per milliliter. He now discusses berberine with every patient in the Insulin Drift window before writing a metformin prescription. I have placed the link to the exact product I reference in this protocol in the pinned comment directly below this video. Do not go looking for it anywhere else. The pinned comment is the first thing you will see when you scroll down. Everything you need is there. Now, I want to be precise about what the research shows and what it does not yet prove, because this is where most health content fails the viewer. The 23 randomized controlled trials involving 1,617 human participants is not preliminary data. The mechanistic evidence is confirmed across multiple independent research groups in multiple countries. The safety profile across those trials is well documented. No serious adverse events at the studied doses. Liver and kidney function panels remaining stable throughout. What we do not yet have is a large-scale prospective trial, specifically measuring long-term insulin drift reversal outcomes in adults over 60 as a defined population. That research is warranted. What we have right now is strong mechanistic evidence, consistent results across 23 independent human trials, a confirmed safety profile, and a 2 to 3% annual cost in insulin sensitivity that makes the timing of this decision clinically relevant. The 23 trials were consistent on one finding above all others. The effect size was largest in adults with early-stage insulin resistance, the insulin drift window, not in adults with established type 2 diabetes, where the cellular mechanisms have been compromised for longer. In the window before clinical diagnosis. In the window Richard was in. In the window that narrows by 2 to 3% every year without intervention. Richard's physician said, "Not a concern yet." The research says the opposite, that this is the most important moment to act, because it is the moment when the intervention produces its strongest response. Take the capsule for the mechanisms the research supports. Give it the 12 weeks the studies used, not the 2 weeks that feel like long enough. Track your fasting glucose and fasting insulin before you begin and at week 12. The numbers the research documents are the numbers worth watching. In the next video, I'm going to show you the morning meal that most adults over 60 eat every day that directly accelerates insulin drift, hiding inside the breakfast that looks responsible and sounds healthy. If this kind of evidence-based analysis is useful to you, subscribe now so you do not miss it. I have pinned a comment directly below this video with the exact product, the exact protocol, and the exact timing written out in plain language. It is the first thing you will see when you scroll down. Everything you need is there. Do not wait. Thanks for watching.